The hospital corridor fell silent the moment the alarm stopped. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy, suffocating kind that comes after something irreversible has already happened. The kind that makes people avoid eye contact. The kind that carries judgment. Oh, Elena stood in the center of it all, her chest still rising and falling too fast, her hands trembling despite everything she had just done to steady them. A single tear slid down her cheek, unnoticed by everyone except the child's mother, who was now clutching her son like she had been handed life itself. And yet, instead of gratitude, whispers began to spread. That was the moment everything started to fall apart. If you believe kindness should never be punished, take a second right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because stories like this deserve to be heard. Elena had always believed that being a nurse wasn't just a job. It was a promise. A quiet, invisible oath to stand between life and loss, no matter how difficult the choice. She had learned that early growing up in a small apartment where her own mother worked double shifts in a public hospital, coming home with tired eyes, but a heart still full enough to care. Elena had watched her patch-up neighbors sit beside grieving families and treat strangers like they were her own. That kind of compassion doesn't fade. It becomes who you are. Years later, Elena carried that same fire into one of the most prestigious private hospitals in the city. Clean floors, polished reputations, and strict rules governed everything. It was a place where decisions were often made not just by medical urgency, but by protocol, liability, and reputation. And on that day, all of those things collided. The boy had come in barely breathing, 8 years old, pale, unconscious. His mother frantic, her voice breaking as she explained between sobs that something was terribly wrong. His condition was critical, one of those rare cases where seconds matter more than systems. But there was a problem. The procedure he needed required immediate authorization. The specialist was delayed, the paperwork wasn't signed, and hospital policy was clear: no intervention without proper clearance. Elena stood there, caught between two worlds. One voice in her mind told her to wait, to follow the rules, to protect her job, her license, her future. But another voice, the louder one, reminded her that a child was dying right in front of her. She didn't hesitate for long. She acted. Every movement became instinct. Training took over. She bypassed the system, initiated the emergency procedure, and fought against time itself. Machines beeped, tension filled the room, and for a moment everything balanced on a razor's edge. And then the boy breathed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Life returned in the smallest, most fragile way, and Elena felt it like a victory that words could never capture. But victories don't always come without consequences. By the end of her shift, Elena was called into an office. Cold faces, tight expressions, words like a violation, a liability, and unauthorized action echoed through the room like accusations carved in stone. No one mentioned the boy. No one acknowledged that he was alive. All that mattered was that Elena had broken the rules, and just like that, her badge was taken. Her access revoked. Her career, at least in that hospital, was over. She walked out with a small box of belongings, the same one now pressed against her side. The end. The same one she held as tears quietly streamed down her face. Not because she regretted what she had done, but because the world had made it feel like she should. Behind her, through the glass doors, a man in a suit stood with his arms crossed, watching her leave. His expression unreadable. His silence louder than any words spoken inside that office. Outside, the sky stretched wide and indifferent. Elena didn't know what came next. Days turned into nights, and the weight of everything began to settle in. Job applications went unanswered. Calls weren't returned. The story, twisted by internal reports, had begun to circulate quietly through the medical community. She wasn't seen as brave. She was seen as reckless, and that label followed her everywhere. Still, Elena held on to one thing: the image of that boy opening his eyes. The sound of his breathing returning. The way his mother had whispered "thank you" over and over again, as if trying to anchor herself to reality. That moment was real. No one could take that away. But hope, like anything fragile, can start to fade. Until the morning everything changed. It began with a sound. Low, distant, unfamiliar. Elena was sitting in her small apartment when she heard it, a deep rumble cutting through the quiet of the neighborhood. Curious, she stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the sunlight. People had already gathered, pointing toward the sky. And then she saw it, a private jet descending. Not toward an airport, a nearby open field. Confusion spread quickly. Whispers turned into speculation. No one understood what was happening, except Elena felt something shift inside her, a strange, unexplainable pull. Minutes later, the aircraft came to a stop. The door opened, and a man stepped out, well-dressed, composed, powerful in a way that didn't need to be announced. Behind him stood another figure, the same man who had watched her leave the hospital. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Elena knew this wasn't a coincidence. The man approached her slowly, each step deliberate. There was no anger in his face, no judgment, only something deeper, recognition. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced everything around them. And in that moment, Elena realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe. Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't end your story. Sometimes... As the truth began to unfold, Elena discovered that the boy she had saved wasn't just another patient. He was the grandson of a man whose influence stretched far beyond hospital walls. A man who had built empires, shaped decisions, and held power in ways most people could never imagine. But none of that mattered to him in the moment that counted. What mattered was that his grandson was alive, because of her. The hospital had made its decision quickly, but they hadn't expected his. And now, standing there with the world watching, he was about to change everything. Before we reach the ending, if this story has touched even a small part of your heart, take a moment to like, share, and let others experience it too. Stories like this remind us what truly matters. And here's a special request. Comment to Kindness always wins if you believe one brave decision can change a life forever. The days that followed didn't erase the pain Elena had felt, but they transformed it. The same hospital that had dismissed her now faced questions it couldn't ignore. Policies were reviewed, leadership shifted, the narrative changed, not because it was convenient, but because the truth had finally found its voice. But Elena didn't go back, because something bigger was waiting. The man who had stepped off that jet didn't just offer gratitude, he offered purpose. A new medical foundation, one built not just on rules, but on humanity. A place where decisions would still be guided by science and safety, but never at the cost of compassion. And he wanted Elena to be part of it, not as an employee, but as a leader. The girl who once watched her mother care for strangers had now become the kind of person the world needed more of. Not perfect, not untouched by struggle, but unshaken in her belief that doing what's right will always matter, even when it costs you everything. In the end, Elena stood not in a hallway filled with judgment, but in a place she helped create. A place where no child would be left waiting for permission to survive. And sometimes late at night she would still think about that day. The silence, the fear, the choice. And she would realize that the moment she thought she had lost everything was the moment she truly found herself. If this story moved you, don't scroll away silently. Like, share, and tell us how it made you feel, because stories like this live through the hearts that carry them forward. The applause didn't come all at once. It started quietly, just a few people at the edge of the field, uncertain, hesitant, as if they weren't sure whether what they had just witnessed was real or something they would later question. Then more joined. Hands came together, voices rose, and before long, the sound filled the air like a wave breaking against everything Elena had believed about how her story would end. But she didn't smile. Not yet. Because deep inside, there was still a part of her that hadn't caught up to what was happening. A part that was still standing in that hospital hallway, hearing cold voices strip her of everything she had worked for. A part that was still holding that box, still walking away. The man in front of her seemed to understand that. He didn't rush her. He didn't overwhelm her with gratitude or promises. Instead, he gave her something far more powerful. Time. Time to process. Time to breathe. Time to believe, and slowly, piece by piece, the truth settled in. The child she had saved, his grandson, was recovering. Stronger by the hour, laughing again, asking questions. Living a future that had almost been taken away by hesitation and paperwork. And none of that would have been possible if Elena had chosen to wait. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. In the weeks that followed, everything began to shift. Not suddenly, but undeniably. The story that had once been whispered behind closed doors started to break into the open. Staff members who had stayed silent began to speak. Some admitted they had wanted to act but didn't dare. Others confessed that fear of losing their jobs had kept them from doing what they knew was right. Elena's decision had forced them to confront something uncomfortable. How many lives had been lost? Not because help wasn't possible, but because permission wasn't given. The hospital, once so confident in its authority, now found itself under scrutiny. Investigations were launched, policies dissected, public attention turned sharp and unforgiving. And for the first time, the institution that had prided itself on control found itself answering questions it couldn't easily dismiss. But Elena stayed away from it all. She didn't attend the meetings. She didn't watch the interviews. She didn't try to defend herself because she didn't need to. Her truth had already been proven in the only way that mattered, through a child who was still alive. Instead, she focused on something new: foundation. At first, it was just an idea, something discussed in quiet conversations between her and the man who had changed everything with his arrival. But ideas, when fueled by purpose, have a way of becoming real faster than anyone expects. Within months, construction began. Not just another hospital, something different, a place designed not only for treatment, but for humanity. A place where protocols existed, but compassion came first. Where doctors and nurses were trained not just to follow procedures, but to think, to feel, to act when it mattered most. And at the center of it all was Elena. The responsibility was overwhelming at times. There were days she questioned whether she was ready for something so big, so important. She had never led something like this before. She had never imagined herself in this position. But then she would remember that moment again. The boy, the breath, the choice, and she would steady herself, because leadership, she realized, wasn't about knowing everything. It was about standing firm in what you believe, especially when it's difficult. The opening day arrived sooner than expected. The building stood tall, modern yet welcoming, its glass walls reflecting a future that felt brighter than anything Elena had allowed herself to hope for. Staff gathered at the entrance, each one chosen not just for their skill, but for their heart. Patients began arriving. Families walked through the doors with uncertainty in their eyes, but left with something they hadn't felt in a long time: relief. Word spread quickly. Not because of advertisements or influence, but because of experiences. Stories began to circulate. Stories of doctors who stayed longer than required. Of nurses who listened, truly listened. Of decisions made in seconds that saved lives instead of delaying them. And with every story, Elena felt something inside her heal. Not completely, but enough. One afternoon, as she walked through the pediatric wing, she heard laughter echoing down the hallway. It stopped her in her tracks. Not because it was unusual, but because it felt familiar. She followed the sound. Oh! And there he was, the boy, sitting up, smiling, surrounded by light and life in a way that felt almost impossible compared to the fragile figure she had first seen. His mother sat beside him, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude that didn't need words. For a moment, Elena just stood there, watching, taking it in, because this was why everything had happened. Not the jet, not the recognition, not even the foundation, this moment. Proof that one decision, one act of courage could ripple outward and change more lives than anyone could ever count. The boy looked up and noticed her. Their eyes met. And this time she smiled, not the kind forced by expectation or politeness, but the kind that comes from deep within, from knowing that something truly meaningful has been done. Time moved forward as it always does. The foundation grew. More lives were saved. More stories were written, not of tragedy, but of second chances. And Elena became something she had never set out to be. A symbol, not of perfection, but of courage. Years later, when people would talk about her, they wouldn't mention the day she was fired as a failure. They would talk about it as the turning point, the moment everything changed. But Elena never saw it that way. To her, it was always simple. A child needed help, and she gave it. Before we close this story, if it touched your heart, even just a little, take a moment to share and let others feel what you felt. Because stories like this remind us that humanity still exists, even in the hardest moments. And never forget, sometimes the world may question your choices, may doubt you, may even try to push you down for doing what's right. But in the end, kindness has a way of finding its way back. Stronger, louder, and more powerful than ever.